Thank you so much. I also need to thank Sri Lankan Army for calling me. This is a great opportunity, and for me, coming to Sri Lanka is like really coming back home. I know it's an afternoon session, and people will be feeling a little soporific after the stupendous hospitality and the great lunch that we just had. But it's a very important topic, so I request all of you to please just put a bit of adrenaline in and sit up for this session. Well, talking about countering violent extremism, I'd first want to do one thing. I want to call my other panelists, and then I'll just give a few comments. So I would like Professor Lalufar Yasmin to please come up on the stage. She's from Bangladesh. And ladies and gentlemen, I have been following terrorism for some time. I must say that Bangladesh has done perhaps one of the most impressive tasks on countering violent extremism. And though, Professor Gursky says that there is no single template, so to speak, I think the successful patterns that have been done by Bangladesh we should look at. I'm also to ask Mr. Michael Jones and Dr. Alexei Muraev to join us on stage. So again, ladies and gentlemen, universality of terrorism is now the new norm. There's religious extremism, there is politically motivated violence, there are multinational organized crime networks, and all of these seem to be related to one another. This makes the whole effort and endeavor of trying to predict, control, and contain extremism that much more difficult. Now, I'm perhaps being a little politically incorrect. This is not addressed to any religion, but the current spate of extremism, a preponderance of the current spate of extremism is unfortunately, it unfortunately takes some kind of root, not root, that's the wrong term, it kind of is related to Islamic countries. 95% of the world's conflicts today are based in Islamic countries, and five of the main terrorist groups, whether it is ISIS or Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, all of them are Islamic, and they claim validity, they claim legitimacy from the Quran. Now, I've had so many speakers who've come up with a lot. When we're talking about countering violent extremism, one of the main things we need to do is to know what the content is, know what we are countering. I mean, it's like what Sun Tzu said, you've got to know the enemy. I mean, the enemy in this case is a terrorist, and that I think universally we would agree that he or she would be an enemy. Now, I just, I'd like to talk about the kind of impact that the internet is having. While I agree with Professor Gursky on many things, this part is something that I, in my experiences, have seen. If we look at Mohammad al-Adnani, the spokesperson of the Daesh who has now been killed, his call, the previous Ramzan, when he came out with the sword of the verse, was his interpretation of the Quran's sword of the verse, in which he said that, immediately after Ramzan, you should go into a killing spree. Then he also spoke about using vehicles and using knives and other such equipment for creating as much problem, as much death and devastations to what he called the kafirs. Now, this has been repeated oft. Now, I know for a fact that in Kashmir, which was used to be a Sufi area, in many of the mosques, we had the khutbahs coming out quoting Muhammad Adnani, which was really, unheard of. And you see, the thing is, while while there is no template for controlling extremism, well, there is no template for radicalization, both ways. No template for controlling, no template for radicalization. But this kind of oft-repeated message creates its own eddy currents, and this is something that we have seen. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to come up with one objective when I talk about why we need to counter extremism. If you would all recall, in Chechnya, the first, the first batch of extremists, like Shamil Bashev and so on, they asked for a Republic of Ichkeria. Their immediate thing was freedom, Republic of Ichkeria. Soon, this morphed. After radicalization came up, it morphed into an Emirat of Kavkaz and Vilayat-e Kavkaz and so on. So this is the model that we are really very scared of. Now, in Kashmir, we are seeing that there is the call for azadi, the call for freedom is being muted. And there is now a call for Islamic rule as per the Sharia. Now this, we can say that is a first step, but it can morph into something very much more. We have seen this in Bangladesh, and which is why I said that Bangladesh has been very successful in countering it. But these are aspects which we need to talk about. Now, when we talk about the gravity of the situation with Mosul and Raqqa, presumably sooner rather than later falling apart, there are bound to be a number of sleeper cells, there are bound to be a number of migrations back into the AFPAC area, migrations into Europe. We can only expect more rather than less devastation. So we need to see what we can do in identifying vulnerable sections and what we can do to see how we can get them back onto the mainstream. Now, there is a talk on how to use multilateral organizations. Now, this, of course, creates its own problems because much of terrorism is actually sponsored, is given the initial impetus, the kick, so to speak, from state-sponsored actors. And in SARC, we are seeing that there are a lot of internal problems which is not helping SARC to grow into an organization which can effectively contain and control terrorism. The same is there with the Middle East countries. My colleague who spoke before made an excellent presentation on that. And there is also these problems within the Southeast Asian countries. So now we have to, I think, identify and see the gravity of the situation and what we can do to go further on that. As regards countering terrorism, I repeat, it is very necessary to understand the narrative of the terrorist and then have two ways. One, which is what we are trying to do in India, which is what the Sri Lankans did at one stage. There is the narrative of the terrorists. There is an alternate narrative where the government does not look at the narrative of the terrorist at all, but just comes with its alternate narrative and says, this is the rule of law and this is what has to be followed. It's the kind of a policy of an iron hand in an iron fist, which is very good in a way to control terrorism. But then God has given us two hands, and the other hand, we hope, should be to extend a hand of friendship, which, in tandem will help rectify and perhaps help give solace to the situation. So what we should do on countering terrorism, what we are doing in India, this is what we are following, and it is premature, of course, to pat ourselves on the back. But we have been fairly successful in containing. I mean, when I say this, I almost, don't want to tempt fate and say something like this, but we have been able to control, to some extent, terrorism, at least in mainland India. And that is because we have very good interactions within the Muslim community. Contrary to the bad press that we are getting, we actually have a number of people in the Muslim community who come and tell us, this child is getting radicalized. The parents come and tell us, and we start targeting the vulnerable sections, and this has worked to a large extent. It has also worked in giving us advance information, which in the time of Telegram and other social media web chats, which are not at all penetrable, it's very useful to have this. We start off with de-radicalization at the vulnerable sections. And then, of course, we do community talking to the parents and so on. But the one thing we are very clear about, if a person takes a step, an irrevocable step of saying, I'm going to buy a weapon, I'm going to get an explosive, I'm going to do this, then the Unlawful People's Act works. And you know, India is a large country. We cannot take any, chances on these matters. This is, as I said, very similar to what is being done in other countries, but if we refine it well, it could, to some extent, work. This would require very, very serious cooperation amongst all countries. We in the SAARC countries are going to be the people who will face the brunt of the migration from the fall of Mosul and Raqqa. It would be very good if at this point we start off by cooperating with one another, forget any political differences, because what we need for countering terrorism is far greater than what our individual countries' initiatives could be. Thank you. I shall now ask my Bangladeshi colleague to talk, and in order to save time, because I know she's a very good speaker, I'm not going to introduce her. I'm going to request all of you to please read her bio in the pamphlet given to you, and she could start off straight away.